Welcome to Mystifying Miracles, and today's story, it involves a gentleman who, he was nearly cut in half, and he survives. I'm going to dive into his story. Stay tuned. Bruce Van Natta, he never forgot that fateful day. It was November 16th of 2006. He was a self-employed diesel mechanic, and he didn't have his own shop, so he would go around and do those things at friends' and customers' shops. Well, on this particular day in 2006, he was on a job about 45 minutes from home, and it had just been one of those days. It was a long, grueling 12-hour day. So as it was ending, he was like, finally, he was looking forward to just going home, relaxing, having some dinner, and hanging with his wife and 4 children. He begins to put all his tools up, and as he's doing that, the driver of the vehicle that he'd been working on asks for just one more quick favor. He wanted Bruce to diagnose an unrelated oil leak. Something simple. Shouldn't take long. And of course, Bruce didn't mind, thinking, of course, it would only be a few minutes. He obliged, and he decides to do that. So he rolls up under the front end of the bumper of the truck that he's working on what was called a creeper. Gets all up under there, and he's looking. He finds the part that he thinks has been leaking oil. So he takes a rag and he begins to just kind of wipe at it so that he could see better. And that's unfortunately when it happened. The truck falls off of the jack on top of Bruce, and it smashes Bruce up onto the cement floor. The front axle hits the mid-torso area on Bruce, and it doesn't just hit it. The way he described it, it hit him with blunt force, such as a guillotine would. And unfortunately, it did almost slice him in two. He begins to panic, obviously, and he tries to take his arms to bench press the truck off, just thinking, I need the pressure off of me. Reality set in so quick, Bruce just begins immediately crying out to God. He says he remembers doing that 2 times. Meanwhile, the driver is panicking, not knowing what to do, but he's in the midst of dialing 911. Now, the engine was on when all this happened, as he was working on the vehicle, right? So Bruce now begins pleading with the driver to please turn off the engine, because you can imagine the vibration of the engine in his torso, that must have been mighty painful. And as he's trying to speak these words to the driver, blood now begins to come out in just little small spurts out of Bruce's mouth. Around this same moment, Bruce was able to grab the chrome front bumper of the truck he was working on, and with all his might, whatever he had, he wanted to thrust his body out from underneath once the engine was off. Unfortunately, you can imagine that situation so chaotic, he's only able to pull his head up out from under the bumper, while the rest of his body is still up under there. He was awake just long enough right as the EMTs were pulling in on the scene. And that's when, in that next second, he says he was 10 to 15 feet in the air looking down on the scene. And he said it was peaceful. He wasn't scared. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't thinking, oh my gosh, that's me down there. What's going to happen? It was none of that. He said it was more like he felt like an observer, sort of like he was just watching a movie scene play out. And he wasn't in any pain. He does remember hearing one of the gentlemen, I'm not sure if it was the driver or another shop worker, but it was a guy that said, there's no way Bruce is going to live through this. He's going to die. Meanwhile, the driver is knelt down beside Bruce's body. He's bawling. He's so upset. He can't even contain himself, and he's just on his knees next to Bruce, and the driver is just kind of rubbing and patting Bruce's head. You can imagine in that moment, he was probably scared out of his wits, but probably also starting to feel some guilt because he was the one that asked Bruce to stay and look at this oil leak. And next thing is quite amazing what Bruce saw. He sees 2 twin angels knelt down right in front of the truck, facing towards Bruce. Facing towards the front bumper. He described it as they were at the least, a foot taller than the driver was. And the driver was just a little over 6 feet. So Bruce kind of estimates in his mind that had the angels been standing, because they were kneeling, they'd have been 8 feet tall easy. He said the angels, he didn't see any wings. They had arms, and both of them were in a position still as statues. These angels had their arms up under the truck, and they were knelt down facing towards Bruce's head. They wore robes that were white and ivory colored, and Bruce says it looks as if their whole bodies just were glowing. Their hair, it went down past their backs. Beautiful blonde hair with little ringlets of curls. And he said they were laser focused, again, still as statues, not talking, not moving, just focused. More people begin to come on the scene, and that's when Bruce says he sees a red-haired EMT. She kindly gets the driver out of the way so that they can move about and do their thing. Then she kneels down next to Bruce. She puts his head into her hands, and she begins talking to him. She starts to repeat the words, "Open your eyes." And Bruce can hear this even being 10 to 15 feet up in the air. But she keeps saying that over and over. And the next thing Bruce knows, he's no longer looking down on the scene, but he's back in his body, and he's looking straight into this woman's eyes. I mean, this was literally the moment where Bruce was on the verge of life and death. Bruce looks around, but he can't see the angels, not with his human eyes. This is about the moment he starts to hear a voice in one of his ears, just kind of telling him to give up. Wouldn't it be nice to rest? Just give up. No more pain. And he says for a brief moment, Bruce closed his eyes because that sounded so enticing. And when he closed those eyes, all pain came to a halt. However, immediately in that same moment, he begins to hear another voice, and it was a soft, sweet whisper in the opposite ear, and it was telling him to fight with all he has. This is just so weird because also in that same moment, the red-haired EMT is still got Bruce's head in her hand, and she begins to ask him, "Who are you fighting for? You have to fight." And he immediately, in his mind, thinks of his wife and 4 children as he can hear her asking that. And he also compared these moments to hearing these voices to those childish cartoons you see where the angel's on one shoulder and the devil on the other. It was almost like that because there's one telling him to give up, just go ahead and die, but the other is telling him to live. And that soft whisper of a voice also began to tell him that it's not going to be easy, but you have to keep going. Bruce was flown to a trauma center where he lived, and during the whole trip, Bruce was conscious. He opened those eyes and he was aware the whole time. Once the doctors got him into the machines and scanned him, they were shocked. He had so many injuries that they didn't even know how to triage it. Where do we start? Because there was so much bleeding, there was so much trauma. It was kind of like the doctors were perplexed because it was just so much. He kept having to have blood infusions because Bruce, he says that they found that they'd give him one infusion, but it kept leaking somewhere. And they found the leak that it was leaking out through his tummy, which I guess makes sense considering that's where the blunt force landed. They decide we need to do another CAT scan. So as they are doing this, Bruce says that God gave him just enough. We're talking just enough strength to get a few words out. And he tells doctors, as they're all doing and preparing for the scan, he says, if you don't do something now, I'm going to die. Bruce was told several weeks after that moment where he had those few words come out that when he said those words, immediately right after, his blood pressure tanked. It dropped. And in that moment, they had no time to think because the doctors had to rush him to surgery. While in the OR, doctors began to reattach several veins and arteries that had actually been completely severed. After that surgery, doctors said they had to wait. It had something to do with to make sure his body recovers, make sure he survives, so he couldn't have another surgery for about 5 to 6 hours. And doctors said, in the meantime, we will cross our fingers and hope he lives, basically. But his family knew better. His family and friends, they didn't want to just sit around and cross fingers. They got to it, and they began to pray. The next morning, doctors were able to take him to the OR again and begin another operation. In this operation, they found that Bruce's small intestine, most of all of it, had to be removed, and amongst other things during the surgery, but that was the main thing. And a couple weeks later, Bruce wakes up, and get this, not even but a month after that, Bruce goes home. However, it was unfortunate because he did get home, but once he was home, and I believe he said it was like a few days that passed, he started having issues, and right back to the hospital he went. It turned out he had quite a bit of pancreas and spleen damage. This cycle continued for a while. They'd release him to go home, only to start having more issues. He'd be back. This happened quite often. Now, it's worth it to note, too, prior to the accident, Bruce weighed about 180 pounds, but now, after all this, he now, just weighed a mere 126 pounds. And of course, that was due to most of his small intestine being gone, because that's where a lot of the nutrients from your food get absorbed. 9 months goes by, and Bruce finds himself waiting for his 5th operation. And it was while he was having the tests prior to that 5th operation where miracles began to happen. Obviously, it was already a miracle that he survived, but now more began to take place. Bruce only roughly had about 200 centimeters of that small intestine left, but a radiologist measured, and he had to remeasure because he found that Bruce now had 300 centimeters of small intestine. That's odd. It was incredibly hard at that time for doctors to believe that there were mistakes because it wasn't just all on one doctor. Many doctors and health staff had double checked, during all the surgeries he's had and hospitalizations. They had measured many times, and there were no miscalculations or mischarting, nothing like that. He had 200 centimeters. Now it was 300. During this part of the story, Bruce makes sure to note, he says, we are to pray with expectation. And this is exactly what many did over Bruce for months during his recovery. And here's one particular part of the story that was quite amazing. There was a man, another Bruce, but his last name was Carlson. So Bruce Carlson had told Bruce that when he came to visit, he placed his hands on him because he was going to pray healing over him. And when Mr. Carlson did this, he told Bruce he felt a jolt of electricity almost just come and pass throughout his body. When he prayed, he was specific. Here's what he prayed. I don't know the word for word, but basically he prayed for Bruce's small intestine to supernaturally grow. I would have never even thought to pray that, to be honest, but wow. And when he did that, Bruce was conscious and he was awake. Bruce says it's odd because when he prayed that specifically, Bruce felt like he described it as a wiggle, like near his tummy, deep inside. So very crazy, but very cool. Now, 3 years went by from that point. So this was now probably around 2011-ish or so. Bruce hasn't had any side effects or physical issues, despite all that trauma that he had endured. And he did end up gaining his almost full weight back. He got back up to 170 pounds. Doctors later admitted that it was absolutely a miracle. Not just one, but several. Because they knew, he was bleeding out, okay? He had many veins and arteries that were severed. They weren't even half on. They were completely severed, cut in half. So that situation alone, he should have bled out in minutes. They also later informed Bruce that he was the only one they've ever seen or known of that's survived having veins and arteries severed like that. Most that did have similar injuries to that extent were DOA on arrival. Bruce says he believes he was allowed to live so that in the end, God's plans would be accomplished, and also so that his name would be glorified. Over the years after Bruce's accident, he says he and his family's faith grew by leaps and bounds. He said, I'm going to get teary about this because I cried when I was reading this part of his story. He said he became, not just he, but his whole family became more compassionate just to other people's needs and issues, where before they had compassion, but now it's like a deep, loving compassion. He said they're more patient with others. And Bruce says he loves sharing his experience, his testimony of seeing those two angels that helped him during that accident. He's shared it with many now, and it's just touched so many lives. A quote from Bruce. He says, "People are affected when confronted with the truth of God's reality, his mercy, and his love." He also says that it is just an amazing blessing to see how God does and performs other miracles in other people's lives. He does have a book. I will link it in the description. It is called Saved by Angels, to share how God talks to everyday people. I hope his story just blessed you guys, because it most definitely blessed me when I was reading it for the first time and making my notes. I find it incredible, very touching, and especially the part about what he and his family learned thereafter in the years to come. But I just want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you're having an excellent summer. I'm going to see you for the next story.